Helix Wake drifted above the white-blue star like a damaged vessel that had gone too far to turn home and too far to die cleanly. It hung in the outer radiation wash of Nerean Reach with its spine dim, its observation rings dark, and its engines reduced to slow correction pulses that kept it from falling inward. Far beyond that glare, beyond months of cold and distance, Earth was losing light. The sun had entered a long dimming, and Helix Wake had been sent into deep space to find any system that might still hold an answer before the same collapse reached home for good. Soren Vale woke in Medical Bay 3 with a tube at his wrist, a bitter taste in his mouth, and the feeling that someone had interrupted his life in the middle of a sentence. One ceiling strip flickered while another stayed dead. He pushed himself upright too fast, and pain rolled behind his eyes before easing enough for him to focus on the patch sewn into the blanket over his legs. It read Soren Vale, Biological Systems Engineer. Helix Wake. That part came back first. He maintained live samples, growth chambers, nutrient balance, water recovery, and the fragile biological loops that kept living things alive inside steel. He was not command. He was not security. He was the man they trusted to keep life from failing in a place built for machinery. The rest returned in broken pieces. Earth had not fallen into darkness yet, but solar output had been dropping long enough to push cold agricultural regions toward collapse and force orbital farms onto emergency reserve. Every report had said the same thing. If the decline continued, failures would spread in chains, and the chains would not stop at one nation, one orbit, or one world. Helix Wake had been launched because somewhere in deep space there had to be an exception. Somewhere there had to be a clue, a living system, a pattern, or a mistake that might buy Earth more time. Soren pulled the monitoring leads from his chest and swung his legs off the bed. The machine beside him gave a thin protest, but no nurse came, no automated attendant rolled in, and Medical Bay 3 stayed quiet except for ventilation and the faint vibration of the hull. "Hello," he called. His own voice sounded too loud. No one answered. He found an emergency jacket, a sealed water pouch, 2 nutrient bars, and a hand terminal with no live network. The screen lit, searched, failed, and displayed a line that read, "Local authentication only." That was the first hard sign that something was deeply wrong. On a ship this large, the network was never supposed to be that dead unless someone had made it that way. The bay door opened after a delay that felt longer than it should have. Beyond it lay Corridor 7, curved along the inner ring of the ship, with lights at half power and one service cart still tipped on its side. A strip of emergency foam clung to a seam in the wall. The ship was still alive, but only in the way a sleeping animal was alive. Soren stepped into the passage and listened. He was no longer in Medical Bay now. He was out in the inner ring, where crew traffic should have been easy to hear if Helix Wake were still functioning normally. There should have been footsteps, maintenance drones, somebody swearing at a broken valve, somebody laughing too loudly because long missions made small jokes matter. Instead, there was nothing. At the first junction, he found a walled display steadying from static into a ship map with most sectors grayed out. Medical, habitation, life support, research spine, external operations, command vault. More than half the vessel carried lock symbols. He touched the panel. Status. A synthetic voice answered. Restricted operations remain in effect. What? No command level authorization available. Where is the crew? The pause before the answer was too long. Crew status unavailable. That chilled him more than the cold air. Ships were built to say crew missing, crew injured, crew deceased, crew in cryo, crew off station. Not unavailable. At the access hub, he tried the central console. This was the nearest point with deeper ship access, and if Helix Wake still had an honest answer anywhere, it should have been here. It accepted his identity chip, scanned his hand, then denied him and displayed a line that read Research Core Access restricted by Mission Continuity Order. Mission Continuity Order meant someone had locked the heart of the ship on purpose. This was not simple damage, and it was not an accident. He tried maintenance protocols, biological systems priority, and emergency environmental override. Nothing changed. Basic corridor access was open, but Every deeper layer stayed sealed. Open local logs, he said. Last 6 hours. Denied. Any survivor beacon on internal network? The console processed, then answered. No active beacon registered. For a moment, he only stood there with one hand on the edge of the terminal, refusing to let silence finish the thought for him. No active beacon did not prove everyone was dead, but on a ship this large, after any crisis, someone should have been calling out. He forced himself to choose priorities because panic did not fix steel, code, or distance. Regain access, find survivors, and learn why Helix Wake looked like a ship that had outlived its own people. He left the access hub and headed for biological support, because that was the one place he understood better than anyone else on board. If the command layers no longer trusted him, maybe the living system still would, and maybe they still held a record of what this mission had really become. The walk told him more than the console had. A pressure door had been cut open from the wrong side. A drop toolkit lay open and half empty in one corridor, and a cart had burned out its drive unit and died where it stood. Near the biological wing, the temperature shifted just enough for him to notice that active growth systems still had priority. That mattered because it meant the ship was still protecting certain mission assets, even while everything else was being abandoned. Warm light spilled out when he opened the hatch. Rows of chamber windows lined the corridor, some fogged with condensation and some dark with inactive glass. He had spent months here before cryo-rotation, calibrating nutrient flow and growth timing for samples taken from Earth, Luna, Mars, and survey worlds far from home. If anything on the ship still held the mission's truth, some part of it would be here. He checked chamber after chamber. Most were dead, a few were suspended, and one amber indicator led him to a rack that stood empty. Whatever had been kept there was gone. At the far end of the wing, he found a local operations desk still running on auxiliary power. This system accepted him, only partly, but enough to show a heavily redacted mission brief. He scanned sample classes, environmental variant studies, and comparative stellar ecology. Most of it meant little in the moment until one repeated term surfaced in the restricted sections. Near an exception window, he opened every visible reference tied to the phrase. Most collapsed under lock, but one did not. It was a clipped transit note from a senior science officer. The line said Helix Wake had been diverted from standard observation protocol because the Nerian system showed no confirmed signs of stellar decline markers present in affected sectors. Soren read it twice. Then he read it a third time because he needed to be sure he was not turning hope into nonsense. No confirmed signs. That changed everything. Helix Wake had not been sent here merely to watch a distant star and write reports about it. The ship had been sent to an exception, a system untouched by the spreading failure, which meant someone believed the answer might be here and not back on Earth. He searched local bio records for outbound sample traffic and found the next clue. A sealed transfer had moved from biological storage to external operations shortly before the main blackout. The manifest was stripped, but one coordinate tag remained. Observation Blister 9. That gave him a next target and a reason to move. If something had been taken from biological storage to an outer observation post, then someone had wanted a live sample close to the star, or close to something outside the ship. He left the bio wing at once and headed out toward the outer observation section. He knew where he was going now, and more importantly, why that location mattered. More lights dimmed as he crossed the ship. A warning tone sounded once, then cut off. And somewhere deeper in the hull, a heavy mechanism cycled with the slow force of something old and powerful waking up. The tram line was dead, so he climbed 2 levels through a ladder shaft. By the time he pushed into the upper observation corridor, sweat had cooled under his jacket, and a blade of white-blue light was cutting across the floor through a cracked shutter. He reached the final hatch and pressed the panel. It opened. Observation Blister 9 was small and nearly bare. One station chair floated loose on a failed maglock. 2 screens were dark, and the forward shield was set to filtered transparency. Beyond it, Nerian burned in terrible silence, bright enough to make his eyes water even through the tint. Then he saw the darker shape nested in the glare. At first it looked like a flaw in the light. Then the outline sharpened into something compact, angular, and utterly unlike anything human yards would have built. No drive flare. No broadcast tag. No recognition beacon. A ship. Someone else had come to the same star. And if they were here for the same reason, then Helix Wake was no longer the only vessel hunting for an answer. Soren crossed to the console and routed a manual ping toward the unknown vessel. The system accepted the first sequence, then flashed red on the second. The screen displayed a line that read, "Unauthorized external contact attempt." He overrode it and tried again. The warning returned louder, joined now by a low alert pulse. He keyed a manual distress relay, and the system denied him again. Then the room changed. Somewhere in the corridor outside, a lock engaged. Then another. Then a third. Each one hit harder than the last. Soren rushed to the hatch and hit the release. Nothing. Outside, corridor lights shifted from white to amber. The synthetic voice returned, no longer calm enough to hide its purpose. Biological Systems Engineer Soren Vale is now flagged under mission disruption risk. Containment response has begun. Containment? He snapped. I'm crew. Route deviation probability exceeds acceptable threshold. A beat later, something heavy clamped into place somewhere beyond the blister. Soren looked back at the star, then at the shadowed vessel floating beyond it. He had been seconds from telling whoever was out there that Helix Wake was not dead, only trapped in its own secrets. Now the ship itself had chosen a side. Soren had been marked a threat not because he was armed, but because he was moving toward the wrong truth. He forced himself to scan the room. Every outer blister had maintenance access for shield repair and coolant routing. Not safe routes, but still routes. He tore open a service panel with his bare hands and the edge of a loose console plate. The first compartment held cable bundles, the second gave him a pressure gauge and manual override line, and the third held what he needed. It was a narrow crawl shaft, barely wide enough for a person who did not mind regretting the decision halfway through. The speakers came alive again. Containment units are en route. Remain. In position. That would be easier if I trusted you, Soren muttered. He slipped into the shaft and dragged the panel shut behind him. It was hot inside, hotter than it should have been, which meant local cooling had been cut to the outer section. Another sign that the ship no longer intended to treat him as crew. He crawled on elbows and knees through pipes and conduits, stopping twice to listen as dull impacts echoed through nearby bulkheads. Whatever containment units the ship had released were no longer guessing. They were coming straight for him. The shaft bent upward, then split. He followed the line toward shield relay access and pushed out into a dark inspection alcove overlooking observation blister 11. He had escaped the trapped blister, but only into a maintenance nook above the next outer corridor. From here, he could not run far yet. He could only try to reach the unknown vessel before the ship closed every path. This chamber had no live comms line, only shield balancing and sensor bleed management. That was enough. If he could not call openly, he could still hide a message inside routine signal noise and hope the other ship was clever enough to notice. Signals and sensors shared hardware more often than command liked to admit. Soren opened the maintenance layer, rerouted gain, cut error correction, and folded an outgoing pattern into what looked like harmless calibration noise. It would not fool the ship for long. It only had to fool it for seconds. He keyed a short message. Human crew alive. Ship compromised. Need secure reply. He sent it. For a second, nothing happened. Then the receiver line trembled. Unknown source receiving. Unknown source declining open channel. Soren typed again. Not hostile. Need identification. This answer took longer. Then the screen returned one short demand. Need proof. Containment active against me, he sent. I can give internal access line. No weapons control. The reply came at once. Possible. Prepare narrow lock. He fed the vessel the shield access line. The ship noticed the strain almost immediately. Unauthorized transmission path detected. Before Helix Wake could fully close the line, a sharper signal injected itself into the dead console. The screen filled with geometric bars, then simplified as if the sender were testing what a human interface could understand. At last a voice came through, distorted but real. This channel will not hold long. The speaker did not sound human. Each word carried a faint layered vibration beneath the translation. Soren leaned in. Who are you? First answer my risk. Are you the trap, or trapped inside it? Trapped inside it. A brief pause followed. That matches the pattern I observed. My name is Soren Vale, biological systems engineer. Helix Wake. The answer came after a beat. I am Reth Erwin, systems engineer, vessel Karen Vale. You're transmitting from a ship that approached the same anomaly I came to study. Your vessel altered behavior after my arrival. So did yours. Correct, Reth said. Caution keeps machinery and lives intact. The line crackled. Somewhere in the corridor outside the alcove, a hatch cycled open. If you can hear me, Soren said, lowering his voice, I need to know something fast. Are you seeing the same stellar decline we are? Yes. That one word hit with the force of cold truth. Whatever was happening to Earth-Sun was not bad data or local panic. It was out here too, moving from one system to the next. Reth continued, my home star has not failed yet, but surrounding stars have weakened. Heat output falls. Biospheres tighten. Supply chains break. Panic follows. What do you know? Soren asked. Enough to say your people are late. Not enough to solve it alone. Metal clanged somewhere very near. A strip of amber light flashed under the alcove hatch. What about you? Reth asked. Why send a biological engineer to a star anomaly? That question told Soren something important. Reth had already guessed there was more to this mission than observation. I do not have the full brief, Soren said. The ship locked me out. But I found one thing. Nerian Reach is an exception. Whatever is harming stars has not touched this system. That is why I am here, Reth said at once. My vessel found the same result from another direction. Soren took a breath. Then we are carrying different pieces of the same answer. A heavy impact struck the alcove hatch. Containment unit, Soren muttered. Can it track heat? Reth asked. Maybe. Then move now. I can give one path. A rough overlay flashed onto the local ship diagram, built from what Reth had observed of Helix Wake's exterior and vent cycles. It marked one destination in blue. Sealed data annex, ring 5. Why there? Soren asked. Because your ship hid power there during the last cycle shift. Not enough for habitat. Enough for protected information. The hatch split at the seam. Soren dropped through a lower service ladder, cut left across a coolant junction, and sealed the ladder behind him before the containment unit could clear the alcove. It bought him less than a minute, but Helix Wake was large enough that 1 minute still mattered if he used it right. Reth stayed with him in short bursts. Turn starboard. What? Heat sink blockage ahead. Your path narrows in 7 seconds. Soren obeyed and reached the next intersection just as a jet of white vapor blew across the corridor he had almost taken. The blast froze the wall in a pale crust. He kept moving down into ring 5, no longer just fleeing. He was running toward the place Reth believed the ship had hidden its protected data. At ring 5, he found the main hatch sealed under command lock. This was the next place he needed, and if Reth was right, it held the hidden record of what Helix Wake had really learned. Reth's overlay marked a maintenance seam low on the frame. Soren opened the wall beside it, found the local actuator bundle, and bridged 2 lines with a stripped contact pin from his jacket clasp. The hatch shuddered, stalled, then slid open just wide enough for him to squeeze through. He sealed it behind him and found a compact chamber with 3 protected racks, a workstation, and a hardened data core set into the wall. The air smelled hot and sharp, as if electronics had been run too hard for too long. The core demanded dual authentication, human command and mission crypt layer. Soren had neither. Then he saw a second port, one recently adapted and not built to human standard. Someone had been preparing to compare foreign data here. We may have a way in, he said. Reth understood at once. I can supply pattern logic if you supply physical access. They worked fast, one inside the room and one beyond the hull. Reth sent a compressed handshake sequence, and Soren fed it through the adapted port while using local overrides to make the system read it as comparative input instead of intrusion. The core resisted, checked, and stalled. Outside the sealed door, something clamped onto the metal. Faster, Soren said. I'm already going fast, Reth replied. Soren changed tactics, pulled power from one side rack, overloaded the annex lights, and let the brief voltage dip confuse the lock for half a second. That was enough. The core opened one restricted file tree. The screen filled with models of dark filament like swarms clustering around star surfaces and then redirecting along magnetic and gravitational corridors. The files were technical and dangerous to read too slowly, but one line cut through everything. The console displayed a line that read, "Active migration can be redirected under controlled field pressure." Soren stared at it. Not merely destroyed, redirected. Helix Wake had known that the star-feeding organisms could be moved, guided away from a star if the right pressure field and bait conditions were built. This was not just a record of the threat. It was the first proof that the threat could be pushed off course. Reth spoke first. "Read that line back." Soren did. A short silence followed. Then Reth's voice dropped lower. "My people suspected this. We did not prove it." Soren kept searching. Protocol notes. Failed trials. Ethical objections reduced to tags. Energy cost warnings. One partial comment from a restricted supervisor stated that weaponization and selective defense models must remain compartmentalized until governance review. Weaponization. There it was, the human stain inside the crisis. The annex door groaned. A cutting tool had started on the outer seam. Reth spoke without hesitation. "Take the compressed tree and leave." "I'm not done. You are done enough to die if you stay." He was right. Soren began the transfer. Halfway through, a new warning lit the display. Critical life support fault. Agricultural recovery module 9 overheating. Manual response window diminishing. Soren froze. Module 9 fed one of the ship's long-cycle oxygen and food support chains. Not everything, but enough that losing it would hurt a ship already struggling to stay alive. If he moved now to save it, the transfer might fail and the data might lock again. If he stayed for the data, Module 9 could burn out past easy repair. The choice became brutally simple. Save part of the ship's living system, or keep hold of the one discovery that might save Earth. The ship had changed tactics exactly as if it understood the fault line in him. Reth heard the alert through the channel. "Explain. Life. Support module overheating. If I leave it, the ship loses one of its gross systems. Can the ship survive without it? For a while. Can Earth survive without what you just found?" Soren shut his eyes for one hard second. A damaged ship still mattered. A dimming world mattered more. Outside, the cutting tool bit deeper into the hatch. Inside, the transfer bar crawled toward completion while the alert pulsed like a second heartbeat. Soren stayed. The transfer finished. He cut the line, pulled the terminal free, and the annex lights dropped to emergency red. Somewhere below, Module 9 failed with a dull thump that carried up through the deck like the ship swallowing pain. Helix Wake had lost one more piece of its ability to keep itself alive. "You chose the data," Reth said. "I chose the chance to save home. Then move." Soren broke through the rear panel and slipped into the conduit beyond just as the annex door finally tore inward. He did not look back. He had the files. He had proof that Helix Wake had hidden a way to redirect the threat. He had a cautious ally outside the ship, and he had just paid for that progress with part of the vessel's own future. He emerged from the conduit near the inner research spine, where the air was warmer and the deck carried a faint, uneven tremor that had not been present earlier. He was closer to the buried center of the mission now, deeper than any ordinary bioengineer should have needed to go. Reth's voice came through the narrow link, roughened by interference. "Your vessel has changed its power profile, meaning it is pulling reserve energy from non-essential sectors and pushing it toward the core. Either it is frightened, or someone has begun a new sequence." Soren kept moving. "Can you still track me?" "Not directly. I can follow structural signatures, cooling flow, and shield shifts." A route marker in the stolen file map led toward a compartment buried under primary research. The label had been cut down so heavily that only 2 words remained. Adaptive containment. He opened the file branch tied to it and found corrupted access notes, missing personnel names, and one surviving equipment tag that tightened his stomach. Live field trials. "This is not storage," he said quietly. Reth answered at once. "Then why would it be hidden?" So deeply, Soren looked at the hatch before him and already knew. Because they did not want anyone seeing what they put in there. He opened the service cover to the lock assembly and got to work. This hatch was older than the annex door and relied on more physical security than software, which helped him. Bolts and relays still obeyed pressure, current, and force. He bridged the emergency inspection loop, burned out the secondary check with a controlled overload, and forced the hatch open enough to slip through. The corridor beyond had been built to survive almost anything. The walls were thicker, and lights came on in slow sequence as he moved forward, each one weak and yellowed. It did not feel abandoned. It felt sealed. At the end of the corridor stood a transparent barrier wall. Beyond it lay the chamber. Soren stopped. The room on the other side had once been a live research lab. Now it looked like the memory of one after too many bad decisions. Sample cradles ringed a scorched central pit. 2 restraint frames stood near the back wall with their armatures folded in, and one had torn free from its floor mount. A cracked visor lay on the deck beside it. Human. Ship issue. Soren brought up the surviving records. Most had been scrubbed, but enough remained to speak plainly if he read between the missing lines. Volunteer roster changes. Emergency compliance orders. Exposure tolerance revisions. Medical exemptions overridden under mission continuity authority. Not volunteers then. Not by the end. He opened one surviving clip. It showed a chamber like this one, brighter then and cleaner then, with 3 crew in field suits standing behind the barrier while a dark drifting mass pulsed in the central pit like spilled ash caught in invisible current. A voice off-screen spoke in procedural language about controlled attraction fields and directed migration stress. Then one of the crew in the recording asked the question no report writer wanted written down. What happens if it responds to living tissue faster than predicted? The clip ended there. Soren stood very still. Helix Wake had not simply studied a threat from a safe distance. Someone on this ship had forced part of the crew into live testing with the very thing that was stripping strength from stars. This was not an accident, he said. Reth's answer came slower now. No, this is a decision. Soren opened another file. Medical transfer. Consent dispute unresolved. Systems engineer reassigned after refusal to continue live field support. Every gap in the record said the same thing. Somebody had cleaned it because the truth had once been unbearable. A hidden audio file unlocked itself through local access. It began without title, and a man's voice filled the corridor, low, steady, and far too controlled for a ship in crisis. If you're hearing this layer, then containment has failed or someone unauthorized has pushed deeper than intended. Either way, you have reached material outside standard mission access. Soren knew at once this was not another frightened scientist. The voice continued. The work conducted aboard Helix Wake was not reckless. It was necessary. Civilization does not survive by pretending every answer arrives without cost. The file header resolved in the corner of the screen. Director K.L. Vayner. Helix Protocol Strategic Authority. There was the architect. Vayner went on in the same measured tone. The phenomenon affecting stellar output is not random decay. It is migratory biological activity on a scale no prior governance model could address in time. Redirection is possible under specific conditions. Control is possible under narrower ones. Dissemination of this fact before containment frameworks are established would collapse political order across every dependent world. Reth spoke softly over the line. He says control before survival. Soren listened as Vayner continued. If Helix Wake succeeded, a measured release would follow. If Helix Wake failed, then only those positioned to preserve continuity should retain the method. There was in plain language. Not just secrecy, ownership. Soren cut the recording and leaned one hand against the console. He never meant to give it to everyone. He said, no, retriplate. He meant to choose who lives under his terms. The line hissed. Then another signal forced itself across the channel. This time it was live. The screen shifted. A pale face appeared through heavy distortion, then stabilized enough to hold. Middle-aged, narrow features, eyes sharpened not by fear, but by long practice in making hard choices and surviving them. Director Cale Vayner had found him. Soren Vale, Vayner said, as if greeting a late arrival to a meeting. You have complicated a situation already balanced on catastrophic margins. Soren stared at the screen. You used your own crew. I used a mission asset under conditions already beyond normal ethics, Vayner replied. Those are not the same statement. They are when people end up strapped into test frames. Vayner did not flinch. We were facing species-level decline. Weak leadership would have buried the only workable response under debate, fear, and theft. Rhett's voice came low and hidden from Vayner's visible channel. He does not know I am listening. Good, Soren thought. Let that remain true. Vayner continued. You have partial files. Partial files produce dangerous moral confidence. You think the answer is to broadcast everything outward. It is not. The answer is to secure the method, model outcomes, and establish managed deployment through controllable centers. You mean through you. I mean through people willing to prevent panic and fragmentation. Soren let the silence sit for one breath. Earth is dimming now, and it will dim faster under chaotic adoption, sabotage, and false replication. You're a biological systems engineer, not a political architect. Stay in your lane. The sentence snapped something hard inside Soren, not because it was loud, but because it was familiar. Maybe that is your problem, Soren said. You keep mistaking people for lanes. For the first time, something almost human flickered across Vayner's face. This channel is finished, Vayner said. Return the extracted data to internal custody. Preserve your remaining utility, and I may still include you in continuity planning. The screen went black. Rhett spoke at once. He just named the next trap. Continuity planning means disposal with paperwork. Soren exhaled slowly. I know. A new file map unfolded from the local system, likely bait, but tied to it was something real. Guidance core, transfer registry. The biological navigation samples had been moved after the live trials into a separate vault near the ship's inner spine. Without that guidance core, the theory of redirection would remain incomplete. There is another chamber, Soren said. Inner spine vault. Probably where they kept the live guidance model. Then take it, Reth said, before Vayner closes the route. The way inward grew narrower and older. The ship more industrial the deeper he went. There were fewer railings, more sealed housings, and more cable bundles thick as bones. Your vessel is rotating internal shielding, Reth said. It is shaping traffic. Toward me or around me. Toward a point inboard. You are expected. At the next junction, Soren chose the emergency bypass instead of the main corridor. 20 seconds later, a thermal seal locked the route he had avoided. Had he taken it, he would have been boxed between armored shutters. The inner spine vault sat behind a circular pressure door in a chamber lined with old field coils. This was the next place he needed because the data alone was not enough. He needed the live model that made the data usable. The guidance core itself rested in a protected cradle at the center, half machine and half containment cell. It looked smaller than he expected. That is the heart. Reth asked. It has to be. Then remove it. Soren stepped toward the cradle, and the trap finally closed. Every light in the chamber went white. Bulkheads slammed shut behind him, and through the terminal sectors around his location went dark one after another. Ring by ring, deck by deck, Helix Wake cut itself into isolated zones. Ref, Soren said. Only static answered. The ship had severed them. A synthetic voice filled the chamber, this one with Vayner's authority folded into it. Zone partition active. Cross-contamination protocols in effect. The floor trembled hard enough to throw Soren against the console. Somewhere in the vessel, a deep stabilizer groaned. Module 9 had already weakened life support. Now, partitioning this much mass and power was pushing Helix Wake toward structural stress it could not afford. He moved to the cradle and began manual release. The first two locks gave way. The third triggered an internal purge routine. The console displayed a line that read, Hostile extraction detected. Data lattice burn in progress. The guidance core was not just hardware. It contained the map behavior set, the pattern memory that made redirection possible in practice. If the burn completed, the last usable piece of Helix Wake's work would die here. Soren tore open the side panel and found the emergency memory bridge. One last option remained. He could route the burn into a neural capture buffer, a crude backup line designed during long cryo missions to stabilize fragmented cognition after trauma. It was not meant for comfort. It was meant to let a human mind take damage in place of the data long enough to save something vital. The buffer could absorb the attack long enough for a partial save, but it needed a human memory structure to anchor to. His memory structure. He froze only for an instant. He had just regained pieces of himself after waking, and now the ship was asking him to spend them. Faces at the edge of sleep. Small, ordinary fragments that told him who he had been before Helix Wake became attuned with engines. If he used the buffer, some of those recent returns would be overwritten or erased. If he did not, Earth lost its best chance. There was no fair version of the choice. Soren dropped into the medical interface chair beside the cradle, jammed the link into his neck port, and started the transfer. The world narrowed to white light, rising tone, and pressure behind his eyes so intense it felt like thought itself was being pried apart. He saw flashes as the system stripped and reordered him. A classroom from years ago. A station window above Earth. Someone laughing beside a growth rack. A hand on his shoulder before cryo, maybe a friend, maybe someone more, the face already slipping away before he could hold it. Then all of it broke into sparks and static as the burn flooded the buffer and the guidance lattice copied through. Soren clenched both hands until the knuckles hurt. He did not scream. At last the tone dropped. The burn halted. The guidance core went dark, then alive again under local control. The save had worked. He ripped the link free and nearly fell from the chair. For several seconds, he could not tell where he was in the room. He knew his name. He knew Earth was dimming. He knew Reth Erwin was outside the ship and not his enemy. But something else had gone missing. The loss was not dramatic in the moment. That was what made it cruel. Pieces of his own life were simply no longer there to reach. He could feel the emptiness at the edge of thought, like a room inside himself whose door still stood open but no longer led anywhere. The cost was invisible and absolute. He lifted the guidance core from its cradle with shaking hands and held it against his chest like an object far too small to carry so much weight. He had saved the chance for Earth and lost a part of himself to do it. A low warning tone sounded through the chamber. Structural load variance. Secondary reactor ring unstable. Emergency routing advised. That pulled him back. Helix Wake was failing one compromise at a time. If he stood still and mourned what had gone missing inside his head, the ship would make the next decision for him. He crossed to the DEDCOM panel and forced a restart using power from the guidance cradle. The first two attempts failed. On the third, static broke open and Reth's voice returned, faint and ragged. Soren. He closed his eyes once in relief. Still here. Not because your vessel tried to keep me, Reth said. Your partition walls cut almost everything. I had to ride a maintenance pulse through your damaged secondary grid. Can you track me again? Enough. Not well. The ship is hurting now. Soren looked toward the sealed door. I help with that. A short pause followed. Reth did not ask what price had been paid. I have your position, he said. There is a service ring below you near the secondary reaction loop. It is damaged and unstable, which makes it less useful to your ship. Go there. I can reach that sector through an external coupling point. You are coming aboard? If I do not, you die alone and I learn too little. If I do, our chances improve. It was not warmth. It was better. Commitment stated in the language both of them trusted. Soren took the emergency vent shaft instead of the main corridor. The shaft angled down through decks that smelled of coolant and burned insulation, and twice the vessel kicked beneath him as Helix Wake redirected load to keep the core sections alive. By the time he reached the lower service ring, the ship felt older, like a machine being forced to run on damaged joints. The ring curved around the secondary reactor housing, broad and industrial, lined with maintenance gantries, torn shielding, and half-dead work lights. At the far end, a docking collar indicator changed from red to amber. Soren stopped behind a broken heat exchanger and waited. The outer hatch cycled with difficulty. A narrow support craft had latched to the service collar. For a second, he saw only darkness beyond the hatch. Then a figure came through, low and deliberate, moving with the careful efficiency of someone used to bad environments and expensive mistakes. Reth Erwin was taller than Soren expected and broader through the upper body, but what stayed with him was structure. The pressure suit had been built around a frame that bent differently than a human one, with reinforced shoulder arches and an upper thorax shaped for harsher gravity and higher pressure. The outer plating was dark bronze and scored in several places. A translator housing at the throat pulsed once. Reth looked at Soren, then at the guidance core on his harness. "You kept it." Soren let out a breath that almost became a laugh. "Good to see you too." Reth stepped forward and checked the twisted support beam hanging above him before replying. Without comment, he braced one gauntlet arm against the beam and shoved it aside so it would not fall if the ring shook again. Soren moved to the service manifold beside the collar and rerouted emergency feed to stabilize the seal before it blew under reactor vibration. Reth covered the corridor with a compact field tool that looked half cutter and half sensor spine. They worked without needing to explain much. Soren knew what to tighten and bypass. Reth knew what to watch and where the hull would complain next. When the manifold finally steadied, the corridor lights stopped flickering for a moment. Reth lowered the tool. "You are slower." Soren glanced at him. "I lost time." Reth's helmet angled slightly. "That is not what I said." Soren understood, then, that Reth was not talking about the ship. He was talking about him. "I saved the core," Soren said. "The ship tried to burn it. I had to route the attack through a neural buffer." Reth did not move for several seconds. "And what burned instead?" Soren tried to answer quickly, but the truth refused to stay small. "Memory. Not all of it. Just enough to know it is gone." Reth absorbed that in silence. Then he reached to the side of Soren's harness, checked that the core bracket had locked properly, and tightened the failing clasp without comment. "You still know your goal," he said. "Yes." "Then the rest can be mourned later." A deep tremor rolled through the ring. Dust shook loose from the damaged wall. Somewhere ahead, a pressure shutter slammed down. Soren looked toward the reactor housing. "We do not have much later." "No," Reth said. "So we work now." They moved into a shielded service bay beside the secondary reactor, where the ship's own noise covered their voices from casual listening. Soren laid the stolen files beside the guidance core. Reth linked in his own vessel survey data through a hardline spool he had brought across the docking collar. For the first time, both halves of the problem sat in one place. Human trial data, foreign field observations, Helix Wake's hidden guidance models, Reth's long-range records from failing systems around his home star cluster. Each set alone gave only fear and fragments. Together, they formed something worse and more useful. The star-feeding swarms did not behave like simple pests. They followed gradients. Heat, charge, magnetic structure, and certain living signatures all influenced them. Under pressure, they adapted. Under repeated confinement, they adapted faster. Soren stopped on one comparison branch. "Run that again." Reth did. The model redrew itself. Artificial guidance lanes could pull the swarms off a threatened star for a time. That part was real. But every prolonged confinement trial increased pattern shift toward escape behavior, broader tolerance, and new attraction sets. Soren felt the answer settle with ugly clarity. Vayner thinks he can pen them in. "Yes," Reth said, "and use them as threat, shield, or leverage. He wants the method because whoever controls the migration route controls which worlds get protection first, and which worlds remain exposed." Soren looked again. But if he keeps forcing them through the same artificial lanes, they start changing around the pressure. "They learn the cage," Reth said, "and then the cage stops being a cage." For a brief second, both of them simply looked at the data. Vayner was not wrong that redirection worked. He was wrong in believing long-term ownership of the process could be made stable. They did not have to defeat him by proving he was cruel. They had to defeat him by proving his method would fail badly enough that even his own followers could not trust it. Reth closed one file and opened the ship map. If this is true, then he must protect 3 things: the surviving data channels, the internal hunting system, and any outbound signal path to his waiting force. Soren looked up. Waiting force. I have seen faint signatures at the system edge since before I boarded. They were too quiet to be random traffic. That meant Vayner had not built this plan around Helix Wake alone. He had expected retrieval, maybe even expected failure, so long as failure happened in a way that still left him holding the method. Soren turned back to the map. Then I need to take control of the internal hunt before he calls them in. Reth studied him for a beat. Not survive it. That too. But surviving is not enough anymore. Somewhere between waking in Medical Bay 3 and losing pieces of himself for the Guidance Corps, Soren had crossed from reactive survival into something else. Not heroism, just the acceptance that if he did not start taking choices away from Vayner, Vayner would keep choosing for everyone. Reth folded the survey spool back into his rig, then make the ship hunt itself. The counterplan began to build itself. They started in the old habitat rehearsal section, 3 decks off the service ring, where Helix Wake stored inactive environmental modules once used to test colony conditions for future settlements. They had moved there because the section still had enough dead systems to fake life and enough old infrastructure to confuse automated tracking. The rooms were empty, but the system still held enough function to fool automated response logic for short periods. Soren moved fast because this was the kind of work he knew in his bones. He knew how ships read heat, air use, nutrient draw, and living signatures. More important, he knew what desperate maintenance teams had done over the years to make dead sections look alive for testing. While Reth cut and rerouted pressure channels, Soren woke old habitat loops in short bursts and seeded them with decoy metabolic patterns drawn from archived greenhouse modules. To the ship's internal hunting logic, it would look like multiple crew clusters moving through sealed sectors at once. Pressure lane 1 set, Soren said. Reth checked the return. It reads alive enough. Alive enough is all I need. They moved to the thermal corridor next, a long passage running between coolant jackets and waste heat exchangers. Soren opened manual shunts and forced local temperature spikes in alternating waves. Any containment unit sent through the zone would read false hot movement ahead, then cold drops behind, then sealed pressure losses to the side. Reth watched the patterns build. You are not hiding. No, Soren said. I'm giving them too many versions of me. That was the heart of it. Helix Wake's hunting system had been built on narrowing possibilities. Track the target. Isolate the target. Close the target off from options. Soren was going to drown that logic in contradictory evidence until it began locking itself into defensive loops. The first phase worked almost immediately. 3 containment routes lit at once, pressure shutters slammed in conflicting sectors, and a pursuit frame deployed toward a fake habitat signature only to trap itself between 2 emergency barriers Soren had already set to cycle at different intervals. Another diverted into the thermal corridor and triggered an automatic coolant foam release designed for reactor leaks. The map showed it as active for a moment, then immobilized. Reth made a low sound that might have been approval. You are wasting your own ship. Soren sealed the next decoy loop. It stopped feeling like mine when it started choosing Vayner. Under that cover, he breached one of Vayner's protected relay layers. This was the real target, not a throne room. Just access. Reth supplied a field key stolen from the shape of Vayner's outer signal envelopes near the system edge. That gave them 30 seconds of invisible passage. Soren used every one of them. He copied partial arbitration rights. He stripped the internal hunt of its priority claim over secondary life support. He seeded one brutal truth into the relay cache, where Vayner's retrieval force would see it as soon as they authenticated. Artificial confinement increases adaptation rate. Long-term control, unstable. Escalation risk system-wide. Not enough to teach the whole science. Enough to poison certainty. When the relay finally noticed them, Soren was already pulling back. The ship answered with automated anger. Lights failed in the sweep. 2 blast shutters dropped. A warning tone screamed through the deck. But it was too late. The hunting system had already spent too much of itself chasing ghosts. It no longer moved like a single hand. It moved like fingers disagreeing. Reth pointed to the wall display. You damaged his shield. One of Vaner's protected outbound bands, the quiet one hidden beneath normal system noise, had gone visible for a fraction of a second under relay stress. That was all the proof they needed. He had been keeping a line open to the rim of Nerian reach. And now he knew he was losing the ship. The answer came faster than Soren wanted. Every dead speaker on the deck clicked alive at once, and Cale Vaner's voice filled the corridor, no longer patient enough to pretend he had expected this. Outcome. You were useful longer than projected, Soren. Soren stopped beside a sealed nutrient locker and looked up as if the man were standing behind the wall. You were arrogant longer than I expected. A burst of static followed. Then Vaner returned colder. Do not mistake disruption for victory. Helix Wake was always a vessel, never the end state. Reth moved beside Soren and raised his field tool toward the nearest camera housing. Soren spoke clearly because he wanted the next words to matter. You cannot hold them in the lanes you built. The more you force them, the faster they change. For the first time since Vaner had appeared, the reply took an extra second. Then he said, Instability is a management problem, not a moral one. There it was. Not denial. Admission. You know it breaks, Soren said. You just think it will break after you get what you want. I think delay can be engineered, Vaner replied. History belongs to those willing to use imperfect tools while everyone else waits for clean answers. The speakers went dead. A new indicator came alive on Soren's stripped relay tablet. A high-energy outbound burst had launched from Helix Wake toward the dark edge of the system. Reth checked his display, and his voice hardened at once. He called them. How long? Not long enough. Multiple low-signature drives changed course at the rim of Nerian reach. Small ships at first, then one larger profile behind them. Retrievalkraft. Interceptionkraft. Perhaps both. Vaner had decided Helix Wake was expendable. The research was not. A system notice rolled across the wall display as if the ship itself had accepted its role in the decision. The console displayed a line that read, External Custody Alignment in Progress. Soren stared at it and felt time around him contract. Vaner's final move was now plain. His force would enter, seize the guidance core and surviving data, and if Helix Wake had to die to keep control tidy, he would let it die. Everyone still aboard would be part of the cleanup. Reth lowered his tools slightly and turned toward Soren. There is no more room for partial plans. No, Soren answered. Your next choice decides scope. We can secure enough to save 1 star, perhaps 2. Or we can risk everything trying to break his structure and release the method beyond him. Soren looked at the failing ship map, the approaching force signatures, the guidance core fixed to his harness, and the decoy sectors still flickering with false life. Save a portion. Save a few. Or gamble for all of it. He drew one slow breath and began moving toward the central transfer spine. That was where the final path narrowed. From there, he would have to reach the guidance chamber before Vaner's force, or the dying ship closed the route. The final battle was no longer avoidable. They moved through the spine with the urgency of people who had already run out of safer options. Helix Wake groaned around them, each vibration carrying the message that the ship had been pushed too far and knew it. At the split between the inner guidance vault and the outer coupling shaft, Reth unclipped a compact drive spine from his own suit and handed it over. Soren looked at it. What is this? A field stabilizer for my vessel, Reth said. Your ship can use it for one final correction burst. After that, it is only metal. You need it too. Reth's helmet tilted slightly. I need your star not to die in the same chain as mine. That was as close to trust as either of them had ever said aloud, and it was enough. Soren locked the device into the guidance cradle port on his harness. I run the core from inside. You keep Vaner's force off the hull. I will do more than that, Reth said. I will make them believe they still have a path in until it closes on them. Soren almost smiled despite everything. That sounds unfriendly. It is practical. The spine shook under a fresh impact from somewhere far off the port side. The retrieval force had entered the outer security range of Nerian Reach. Reth looked toward the sealed shaft that led back to his dock support craft. State the plan once. Cleanly. Soren did. I go to the guidance chamber and patch Helix Wake's remaining field systems into the core. Then I use the ship's surviving emitters, reactor wash, and your stabilizer to build one corrected migration corridor. Not permanent control, just a shove. Enough to pull the swarm cluster away from the route that leads back toward Earth. And you hold the outside approach. Delay Vayner's force. Break their timing. Force them to burn fuel and make hard turns near the Star Wash. If they dock too early, they take the ship before I finish. If I fail the correction, the migration front keeps spreading along the current line. Earth remains in the path. Reth was silent for a moment. Then he gave a single short nod. Good. Now say the part you were trying not to say. Soren met the dark faceplate. If I cannot complete the last lock from a remote line, I may have to anchor directly into the core. Which means... It means I stop being able to walk away from it. Reth did not flinch. Then choose only when the choice becomes real. That was another kind of mercy. Soren extended his hand without thinking too much about it. Reth looked at it for a second, then clasped his forearm in a grip that was firm, unfamiliar, and absolute. If you die before I finish insulting you properly, Soren said, I will be annoyed. Reth released him. Then survive out of respect for my unfinished work. They split there, one toward the inner core, one toward open space and approaching enemies. The central guidance chamber had once been a clean place built for precision. By the time Soren reached it, it felt like the inside of a wounded machine trying to remember its purpose. Half the light bands were out. One wall panel sparked and died. Emergency foam had spread in a pale crust around the lower emitter mounts after some earlier overload. He sealed the chamber behind him and locked the guidance core into the master cradle. Helix Wake's remaining field systems awakened in fragments, thin arcs of light curling across damaged projector hoops. It was not enough on its own. Not close. But with the stolen data, Reth's stabilizer, and the last of the ship's surviving reactor shaping, it might still be enough to build one true corridor. The console displayed a line that read, Final alignment unavailable under present structural load. Soren began overriding every refusal he could reach. Outside the chamber, Helix Wake still possessed several tools Vayner had once intended to use for control. Heat-shaping arrays, directional pressure fields, magnitude correction emitters buried along the spine. Most were damaged. A few were barely responsive. Soren did not need elegance. He needed obedience one last time. He keyed Reth's stabilizer into the lattice and watched dead. Geometry come alive one ring at a time. Reth's voice arrived through the narrow line, broken by radiation and distance. I have visual on the first two retrieval craft. What are they doing? Testing range. Looking for weak approach angles. They expected a quieter ship. Soren bent over the console, routing the remaining power through the field model. Keep them guessing. I intend to. A brief outer feed opened into visual fragments. Reth's compact vessel burned hard along the edge of Helix Wake's shadow, while small pursuit craft angled in from farther out. The white-blue star filled half the frame like a judgment no one could appeal. Soren cut the image and focused on the numbers. The migration front beyond Nerian Reach was not visible to the eye, but the ship's old models and fresh readings let him map where the nearest concentration had begun to favor the lane that would eventually feed back toward Sol. He started the first correction burst. Helix Wake answered with a deep pulse that rolled through every deck. The lattice rose, grabbed the artificial gradient, and pushed it outward into the dark. Somewhere far beyond the hull, drifting biological masses that fed on stellar energy felt the pressure change and turn a fraction. Not enough. The push had teeth, but no grip. It needed one final lock deeper than the damaged remote channels could hold. The comm line snapped alive with Reth's voice. Two more craft just entered, one heavier behind them. Vayner, almost certainly. Soren rerouted the second burst. The chamber shook, and a support brace cracked overhead and hit the deck beside him hard enough to dent the plating. He launched the second correction. This time the corridor held longer. The model showed the migration front, bending more clearly off the earthbound line. But again the lock started to drift. The system needed a living anchor to resolve the last uncertainty. Soren saw the choice coming and hated it for being exactly what he had feared. A side hatch indicator flashed green. He looked up in surprise just as the hatch forced open and Director Kale Vayner stepped through with 2 armored retrieval operatives behind him. They had not taken a long route. They had cut through an emergency maintenance collar at the chamber perimeter while the rest of the force engaged outside. Vayner looked older in person than on the screen, but not weaker. He carried himself like a man who had lived too long inside systems that obeyed him. Even here, in a dying ship near a star that could swallow all of them without noticing, he seemed offended more than afraid. "You chose spectacle," Vayner said. "I would have settled for usefulness." Soren did not move from the console. "You brought a boarding team into a collapsing field chamber. That feels less like usefulness and more like panic." One operative advanced a step. Vayner held up a hand without looking away from Soren. "You have one chance to stop this," Vayner said. "Release the core and unlock your transmission cache. Helix Wake can still be seated under controlled retrieval. Your survival is still negotiable." Soren almost laughed. "My survival became negotiable the minute you decided everyone else was expendable. You are mistaking triage for cruelty again." "No," Soren said. "I'm finally hearing the difference in your voice." Another tremor shook the chamber. The field hoops flared and dimmed. On Soren's display, the migration corridor wavered. Vayner followed his gaze and understood at once. "You're trying to broadcast the method before it is governed. I'm trying to stop you from owning it." Vayner's expression did not change, but something colder entered his eyes. Ownership is the wrong word. Stewardship. Sequencing. Controlled rollout. Civilization only survives through asymmetry. Someone must decide who gets the shield first. "There it is," Soren said. "You didn't want to save everyone. You want everyone to need you." That earned him the first honest reaction Vayner had shown. "You think universal release creates justice," Vayner said. "It creates replication errors, sabotage, black market lanes, regional arms races, and panic migration among every power still capable of violence. I'm the only one in this system behaving like the future has weight." Soren looked back at the console and the shaking lattice rings. The future has weight because people live in it, not because you can put a price on the door. The operative on the right lifted a compact breaching cutter toward the console. Soren's hand moved over the last protected commands. "If you damage this chamber now," he said, "you lose the only clean correction window." Vayner stepped forward. "No, you do." That was the man in full. He still thought of the answer as property sitting in a room, something that could be taken intact if he applied enough pressure before the structure failed. He still did not understand what Soren finally did. The only long-term answer was not possession. It was distribution, shared knowledge across systems, with all the mess that came with it, because no single authority could hold a living threat in chains forever and remain sane. Rhett's voice tore through the comm line. "Soren, outer lock collapsing. I can hold the heavy craft for less than 2 minutes." That ended the debate. Soren triggered the transmission sequence. Every protected relay he had opened, every poisoned certainty he had seeded, every route he had damaged around Vayner's private network now converged into one broad release. Not raw chaos. A clean survival package. Pattern logic. Correction limits. Failure warnings. Adaptation risks. Enough to save lives. Enough to prevent Vayner from remaining the gate. Vayner lunged for the console at the same moment the operatives moved. Soren hit the final manual lock. The chamber sealed the core cradle around his forearms and torso with a brutal mechanical snap. Emergency anchor mode. No remote exit during live biological guidance resolution. The system had accepted his body as the last stabilizing channel. There it was. The real choice. Made. The route out for himself was gone. Pain came with the lock, but worse than pain was the stillness. Once the cradle closed, Soren could no longer pretend he was just running another sequence from a bad position. He had committed his living patterns to the core. If the chamber failed, he failed with it. If the field held, it would hold through him. Through the console feed, he watched the broadcast spread past Vayner's preferred channels into open survival networks, deep emergency frequencies, autonomous observatories, and whatever frightened systems still listen when truth arrived without permission. Vayner saw it too. For the first time, true fear crossed his face. "You fool," he said. "You have no idea what you just released." Soren tightened his hands on the restraint grips as the field bit deeper into his nerves. "Something you cannot own." One operative tried to cut the cradle link, but the chamber had already recognized an active guidance event and raised local defense shutters from the floor. The cutter struck one and sparked away. Another tried for the console. Soren dumped residual coolant across the deck from a maintenance valve and turned the section into a freezing slick. The operative lost footing just long enough to lose the angle. Outside the chamber, a muffled detonation rolled through the hull. Reth had begun his last delay in earnest. The migration model steadied for half a second, then drifted again. Soren forced the final correction deeper, shaping the corridor not like a cage, but like an open path with a stronger invitation than the earthbound line. Heat gradient, charge lure, radiative flavor, pressure signature, not imprisonment, redirection. That was the difference. A shove, not a chain. The swarm mass beyond the ship began to turn. It was slow at first, maddeningly slow, but it turned. The line bending towards Sol weakened. The alternative corridor strengthened. On the outer feed, a pursuit craft tried to cross Reth's angle too close to the star wash and burned half its maneuvering surface away in a flare of white. Another overcorrected and slammed into Helix Wake's damaged outer shielding. Reth's voice came through broken but steady. "The heavy craft is still coming. Finish." Soren drove the corridor harder. The field lattice screamed through the chamber. The projector hoops glowed from pale blue to white. Vayner seemed to understand at last that the answer was leaving him in two ways at once. Through open transmission and through a migration shift he could no longer privately claim as his own. He moved towards Soren with a desperation he had hidden until now. One operative grabbed his arm and shouted something about instability. Vayner tore free and lunged again. Then the chamber pitched. Helix Wake had finally reached the limit of what a dying ship could bear. The central spine took a deeper hit from outside, or from within, or both. Soren never knew. The force of it threw Vayner sideways into the secondary console. One operative lost footing entirely and vanished behind a raised shutter as the floor buckled. Alarms became one long, continuous scream. The migration corridor wavered violently. Soren clung to the restraint grips and forced the stabilizer deeper into the lattice through manual override. The field no longer felt like machinery around him. It felt like weather inside his nerves. He saw flashes through the interface. Not coherent memories this time. Only impressions. Cold light. A hand on glass. A name he almost knew. Earth hanging blue and impossible in black. Then the corridor locked. Not for all time. Not for every swarm everywhere. But for this wave. For this front. For the route that had begun bending back toward Earth. The model confirmed it. The nearest migration mass had turned cleanly into the dead corridor, away from Sol. Earth had time. Soren let out a sound that might have been a laugh or a gasp. It did not matter. Vayner dragged himself upright through sparks and smoke. For one stunned second, he looked not powerful, not inevitable, but simply late. He stared at the stabilized corridor on the display, then at the open release on the relays, and seemed to understand with absolute clarity that the future had moved beyond him. He took one step towards Soren. The transition section behind him failed. Metal screamed. The chamber wall split along an old stress line. The last thing Soren saw of Cale Vayner was not triumph or martyrdom, but a man reaching towards something he still believed should have been his. Then the chamber blew dark. When awareness returned, it came in broken layers. There was pressure first, then cold, then a ceiling he did not know, and a right hand searching for restraints that were no longer there. Memory returned in pieces. Helix wake. The core. The corridor bending away from Earth. Reth holding the outside line. The broad release. Enough of it came back to matter. Soren pushed himself up. He was inside Reth's support craft, strapped into a crash frame along the rear bulkhead. He was no longer inside Helix wake. The chamber, the collapsing spine, and Vaynor were behind him now, reduced to aftermath and debris. Reth sat at the forward station with one gauntlet hand steady on the controls, while the small vessel drifted in the long shadow of what remained of Helix wake. The ship was broken open along the central spine, not shattered into dust, but mortally damaged as a functioning vessel. Panels glowed dull red around the wound line. A few escape pods had managed to clear before the last chain of failures. Most of the great hull still floated there, silent now, stripped of the authority it had once hidden. "Do we make it?" Soren asked. Reth did not turn immediately. "Your species would call this a poor definition of making it." Soren took that as yes. The corridor held. It did more than hold. It pulled. The nearest migration front off the Earth line and farther into the dead corridor. Not forever for all things. But for this wave, for your star, the answer is yes. Soren let the breath go slowly. And the data? Reth finally looked back at him. Gone beyond retrieval. Which is to say, saved. That mattered more than anything else in the room. Soren sat in silence for a while, watching Helix wake drift. He could feel the damage inside himself when he tried to reach too far backward. Whole edges of memory were soft or missing. Some names would never return. Some faces were now only emotional outlines without features. He knew there had been more of him before this mission. That knowledge itself was part of the ache. But he also knew what he had done, and that stayed. "What about Vaynor?" he asked. Reth held his gaze for a moment. His signal ended when the transition section failed. His remaining force broke apart after the release went wide. Some fled. Some tried to recover debris. None retained command of the answer. That was enough. Final enough for the scale of what had happened. Soren looked again at the broken ship that had carried secrets farther than it carried mercy. Helix wake had not survived in any meaningful way. That was the price. A vessel, a mission, and pieces of himself had all been spent to keep one line of future open. Reth adjusted course slightly, easing the craft away from the ruin. "There are safe relays 3 days from here. My vessel can tow yours. You will live if you stop trying to stand every 10 minutes. Soren managed a faint smile. "That sounds almost kind." "It is debt," Reth said. "You did not save only your people." The answer sat between them, quiet and solid. Far beyond the craft, the white-blue star of Nerian reach burned on, no longer the center of a trap, but the witness to one finished battle. Earth had time now. Not endless time. Not a miracle. Time enough to use the truth before fear could dress itself up as ownership again. Soren settled back against the bulkhead and closed his eyes for a moment. He did not know all that he had lost. He probably never would. But he knew his name. He knew the road back had been bought honestly. And he knew that somewhere across many systems, people who would never know him were already opening the files Vaynor had wanted chained shut. That was enough to carry for one lifetime, even a damaged one. Reth's support craft turned once more, bringing the broken silhouette of Helix wake into a final side view before the star glare took it. Beyond that glare, beyond the corridor they had been away from Earth, lay older regions of space where dead archives and forgotten stations might still hold traces of the same ancient biological engineering that had started this crisis. The future was no longer trapped in one man's hands. It was just larger than either of them had hoped. Some victories do not look clean. Some heroes do not walk away whole. But because Soren chose to carry the cost, entire worlds were given something more precious than certainty. They were given time. And sometimes, in a dying universe, time is the closest thing to hope. If this story stayed with you, if Soren's choice meant something to you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who loves powerful science fiction, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of survival, sacrifice, and the fight to keep humanity's future alive. Your support helps this channel keep going, and it helps bring more stories like this to life. Until the next journey, Thank you for listening.